The river ran wild through the canyon that spring morning in 1878, swollen with snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada, and Louisa Jenkins stood knee-deep in the churning water, reading its currents like other women read their Sunday psalms. She had been studying this particular stretch of the Sacramento River tributary since dawn, watching how the debris moved, where the eddies formed, noting the shallow spots that shifted daily with the relentless push of winter runoff. The cattlemen gathered on the bank behind her, their voices raised in argument about whether to attempt the crossing or ride another 20 miles upstream to the ferry. But Louisa had already made her assessment and was walking back toward them with water streaming from her split riding skirt. "It can be forded here," she announced, her voice carrying over their debate. "But you need to angle downstream about 15 degrees from where you are now. There is a gravel bar 6 feet out that will give the cattle purchase, and the deepest channel runs close to the far bank, not this one." The men fell silent, and Louisa recognized the familiar mixture of skepticism and curiosity on their sun-weathered faces. She was used to it by now, had been proving herself since she was 16 years old, and her father had first taught her to read water the way he had learned from the Yokuts people who had lived along these rivers for centuries before the Spanish ever came. Her father had been a surveyor and river guide, and he had taken her with him on every job after her mother died of cholera. Now, at 22, Louisa had guided more cattle, wagons, and settlers across California's temperamental waterways than most men twice her age. "Begging your pardon, miss," said one of the drovers, a barrel-chested man with gray in his beard, "but that current looks mighty strong. We lose cattle in there. Mr. Hammond will have our hides." "You will lose more if you try to cross where the main channel runs," Louisa replied evenly. She had learned not to let irritation show in her voice, had learned that men responded better to calm certainty than to wounded pride. "The water is fast, but it is only chest deep on a horse at the line I am showing you. Any deeper and you risk losing your footing entirely. The gravel bar gives them something to push against." She turned to look for Hammond himself, the owner of the herd that had been gathering dust on the near bank for the past hour. She found him easily, a tall figure on a blood bay gelding, sitting apart from his men and watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He had hired her in Wasco 3 days ago when his regular guide had taken sick with fever, and though his foreman had objected to bringing a woman on a cattle drive, Hammond had overruled him with a curtness that suggested he did not care much for other people's opinions. "Miss Jenkins," he called now, nudging his horse forward. "You are certain about this crossing?" Louisa met his gaze directly. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, the color of storm clouds over the valley, and they studied her with an intensity that made something flutter in her chest. She pushed the feeling aside, keeping her attention on the matter at hand. "As certain as anyone can be with a river in spring flood," she said honestly. "But I have crossed here a dozen times in these conditions. If you follow my instructions exactly, you will get your herd across safely." Jacob Hammond was not a man who trusted easily, but there was something about the way this young woman stood before him, soaked to the waist and completely unbothered by it, that made him want to believe her. He had heard about Louisa Jenkins from a rancher in Wasco, had heard that she knew the rivers better than any guide in the San Joaquin Valley, that she had never lost a head of cattle or a wagon to the water. His foreman had scoffed at the idea of hiring her, but Jacob had his own reasons for trusting competence over convention, and he was willing to gamble his herd on it. "All right," he said. "We cross here, but you lead the way, Miss Jenkins. Show us the line." He saw surprise flicker across her face, quickly masked. Most men who hired her made her stand on the bank and point while they took the actual risk themselves, as though her knowledge was acceptable, but her participation was not. Jacob did not hold with that kind of thinking. If she was willing to stake her reputation on this crossing, she should be willing to stake her life on it too, and he wanted to see her do exactly that. "I will need a horse," Louisa said. "Take mine." The words were out of Jacob's mouth before he had fully thought them through, but he did not regret them. He swung down from the bay gelding and held out the reins. "His name is River. He is steady in water and he will not bolt on you." Louisa took the reins, running her hand along the horse's neck with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of her life in the saddle. The gelding whuffed softly and turned his head to lip at her wet sleeve. She pulled herself up with an economical motion that spoke of long practice, settling into Jacob's saddle as though it had been made for her. From this new vantage point, she looked down at him, and something passed between them, some wordless acknowledgment that felt like the beginning of a bargain neither of them fully understood yet. "Keep the herd tight," she told the assembled drovers. "Do not let them string out or they will lose each other in the current. Push them steady but not fast. Let them find their footing. And for God's sake, stay mounted. If you go into the water on foot, I cannot help you." Then she turned the bay toward the river and rode in without hesitation. Jacob watched her go, watched how she sat deep in the saddle and kept her weight centered, how she used her legs to guide the horse rather than yanking on the reins. The water rose quickly, darkening the horse's shoulders, and then they were in the main current, the gelding's powerful hindquarters driving against the flow. Louisa angled downstream just as she had instructed, and Jacob could see now what she had been talking about, the way the water shallowed slightly where the gravel bar must lie beneath the surface, the way the horse found better purchase there. She made it across in less than 5 minutes, the bay gelding lunging up the far bank and shaking himself like a dog. Louisa turned him to face back across the river and raised one arm in signal. Jacob felt something ease in his chest that he had not realized was tight. "You heard her," he barked at his men. "Tight formation, angle downstream. Move." The drovers sprang into action, whooping and whistling to get the cattle moving. The herd had been pushed close to the water's edge, 300 head of prime beef cattle that represented most of Jacob's wealth and future. They balked at first, the lead steers tossing their heads and trying to turn back, but the drovers pressed them hard, and finally the first few plunged into the water. Once the leaders went, the rest followed with the mindless determination of their kind, a river of hide and horn flowing into the actual river. Jacob borrowed a horse from one of his men and rode into the water with the herd, positioning himself on the upstream side where the current was strongest. The cattle swam with their heads up, eyes rolling white, but they followed the path Louisa had set, angling toward that invisible gravel bar. He could feel it now himself, the way his horse's hooves found slightly better footing in that line, and he marveled at her ability to see such things just by watching the surface. 3/4 of the way across, a young steer panicked and tried to turn back against the current. Jacob saw it happening, saw the animal thrashing and pulling 2 others with it, creating a jam that could turn into a disaster in seconds. He spurred toward them, his horse plunging through the deeper water, but before he could reach the tangle, Louisa was there, coming back into the river from the far side. She rode straight at the panicked steer, shouting and slapping her rope against the water, and the animal's instinct to flee drove it forward again, breaking the jam. The other cattle surged past, and the moment of danger was over. By the time the last of the herd scrambled up the far bank, the sun had climbed another hand's width into the sky and Jacob was soaked through and breathing hard. His men were grinning with relief, counting heads and finding they had not lost a single animal. Louisa sat her horse off to one side, water dripping from her clothes, her dark hair escaping from its braid in wet curls around her face. She looked tired but satisfied, and when Jacob rode up to her, she gave him a small smile that transformed her serious features into something almost beautiful. "Your gelding is well named," she said, patting the bay's neck. "He did not put a foot wrong." "Neither did you," Jacob replied. He took his hat off and dumped water out of the crown, then settled it back on his head. "That was the finest piece of river work I have ever seen, Miss Jenkins." "It was a straightforward crossing," Louisa said, but he could see the pleasure in her eyes at his words. "You have good cattle. They did not lose their heads." "One of them did," Jacob pointed out. "You saved it." She shrugged, dismissing the danger as though riding back into a flooded river was no more remarkable than crossing a street. Jacob found himself studying her more closely, taking in details he had not noticed when he hired her in Wasco. She had strong features, a firm jaw and a straight nose, and her eyes were a warm brown that reminded him of oak leaves in autumn. Her hands on the reins were rope-scarred and capable, the hands of someone who worked for a living, and there was something about the set of her shoulders that suggested she would not break under pressure. "We are making for the Triple T Ranch north of Red Bluff," he said. "There are 2 more river crossings between here and there. I would be obliged if you would stay on as guide for the whole drive. I will pay you double your usual rate." Louisa looked surprised again, then considering. "I told you I would guide you as far as Red Bluff when you hired me in Wasco." "That was our agreement." "I know what our agreement was. I am making you a better offer." Jacob was not sure why it suddenly seemed important to keep her with the drive, but he found he very much wanted her to say yes. "My men will accept your authority now that they have seen what you can do. And I trust you to get us through safely." The words hung in the air between them, more weighted than he had intended. Louisa was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his face as though looking for something she had lost. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Mr. Hammond. I will guide you all the way to Red Bluff." They pushed on through country that was green and lush with spring growth, the cattle fattening on new grass as they moved north through the Sacramento Valley. Jacob found himself riding beside Louisa more often than not, drawn by her quiet competence, and the way she seemed to see things in the landscape that he had never noticed before. She pointed out where beaver dams had changed the flow of small creeks, where the soil was too sandy to support a wagon in wet weather, where game trails crossed the river at the shallowest points. She talked about water the way some men talked about horses or cattle, with a deep understanding that went beyond mere knowledge into something like love. "My father used to say that water is the most honest thing in creation," she told him one evening as they sat by the campfire after the herd had been bedded down. "It always goes where it wants to go, and if you try to force it, it will find a way around you or through you. The trick is to work with it instead of against it." "Sounds like your father was a wise man," Jacob said. He was mending a bridle by the firelight, his fingers working the leather automatically while his attention stayed on her face. "He was." Louisa's expression grew distant. "He died 2 years ago. Pneumonia after he took a bad fall into the Kern River in winter. By the time they got him out and dried off, the damage was done. He held on for a week, but his lungs never recovered." "I am sorry," Jacob said, and meant it. "You must miss him. Every day." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks drifting into the darkness. "He taught me everything he knew about rivers and land. He wanted me to have a trade that would support me no matter what happened, something I could do that did not depend on finding a husband or inheriting property. He knew what it was like for women without means or protection." Jacob heard the weight of experience in those words, the understanding that came from living in a world that did not make things easy for women alone. His own mother had been widowed young, had raised him and his two sisters on a hardscrabble ranch in Montana Territory, and he had watched her fight for every acre and every head of cattle against men who thought a woman had no business running a spread. He had learned from her that strength came in many forms, and that underestimating someone based on their sex was a fool's mistake. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," he said, "the kind who understood what mattered." He was. Louisa looked up at him, and in the firelight her eyes were very dark. "What about you, Mr. Hammond? Do you have family?" "Jacob," he corrected. "And yes, I have two sisters back in Montana. They are both married now, running ranches with their husbands, good women, tough as leather. They take after our mother. And your mother died 3 years back. Heart gave out one night while she was sleeping. She worked herself to death, I think, though she would never admit it." He finished with the bridle and set it aside, leaning back against his saddle. "She left the ranch to my sisters, since they were the ones still working it. I had already come down to California by then, bought land in Wasco with money I had saved from guiding wagon trains over the Sierras. The Triple T is not mine, but I am building a herd to start my own place when I find the right land." "So these cattle represent your future," Louisa said thoughtfully. "Everything I have and everything I hope to be," Jacob agreed. "That is why I am grateful you have been guiding us. I cannot afford to lose them." She nodded, understanding. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, the cattle lowing softly to each other, the chuck wagon cook rattling pots as he cleaned up from supper. Jacob found himself acutely aware of Louisa's presence, the way the firelight played across her features, the capable set of her hands resting on her knees. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, and he realized with some surprise that he was beginning to care for her in a way that went beyond simple respect for her abilities. The thought should have troubled him, but instead it settled into his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Over the next week, as they pushed north toward Red Bluff, Jacob and Louisa fell into an easy partnership that surprised them both. She taught him to read the small signs that indicated how deep a river ran, where sandbars shifted, how to tell if a bank was stable or undercut by current. He taught her the finer points of managing a large herd, how to spot a lame animal in a crowd, how to judge the quality of grass by its color and the way it grew. They talked about everything and nothing, and Jacob found that he looked forward to each evening when the work was done and they could sit by the fire and simply be together. His men noticed, of course. They would have to be blind not to see the way Jacob watched Louisa, the way he made sure she had the best portions at meals, the way he positioned himself between her and any potential danger without even thinking about it. But if they found it strange that their boss was courting a river guide, they kept it to themselves. Louisa had earned their respect with her skill and her willingness to take the same risks they did, and that counted for more than convention in their eyes. The second major crossing came at Cottonwood Creek, which was running high with spring melt and looked meaner than a rattlesnake in the morning sun. Jacob watched Louisa study it with her usual careful attention, walking up and down the bank, wading in at several points to test the current and the footing. Finally, she came back to where he waded with the herd. "This one is trickier," she said without preamble. "The main channel shifts here, runs along this side for 50 yards and then cuts across to the far side. We need to take them down to that bend, cross there, and then push hard upstream on the far side to avoid being swept into the rapids below." Jacob looked downstream at the white water she was talking about and felt his jaw tighten. "How bad are those rapids?" Bad enough that I do not want to find out if your cattle can survive them, Louisa said bluntly. We cross at the bend or we go another 15 miles upstream. Your choice. It was not really a choice, not with the herd needing good grass and water, not with the schedule they needed to keep. Jacob nodded slowly. We cross at the bend, same formation as before. Yes, but tighter, and we need 2 riders on the downstream side to keep them from drifting. It will be harder than the last crossing. Nothing worth doing comes easy, Jacob said. He caught her gaze and held it. I trust you, Louisa. It was the first time he had used her given name, and he saw her register it, saw something shift in her expression that was quickly hidden. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Then let us get your cattle across this creek before it gets any higher. They moved the herd down to the bend, and Louisa took her position on the blood bay gelding that Jacob had simply given her after the first crossing, saying he could ride any of the spare horses. She waited until everything was in place, until the drovers were positioned exactly as she wanted them, and then she rode into Cottonwood Creek with the same fearless determination she had shown at every other water crossing. The gelding hit the main channel and immediately struggled against the current, which was stronger than anything they had faced before. Jacob, watching from his position with the herd, felt his heart climb into his throat as the water rose to Louisa's waist, as the horse's head came up, and his eyes showed white. But Louisa sat firm and kept the gelding moving forward, kept him angled upstream against the push of the current, and after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the far bank and scrambled out. Then it was the herd's turn. The cattle went in reluctantly, and Jacob and his men had to push them hard to get them committed to the crossing. Once they were in, the current grabbed them, and Jacob saw immediately that this was going to be a near thing. The steers swam frantically. Their bodies swept downstream despite their efforts, and 2 of his drovers had to ride into the water on the downstream side to turn them back into the correct line. Jacob was in the thick of it himself, his horse swimming strongly beneath him, when he saw one of his men lose his seat. The drover hit the water with a splash and went under, came up thrashing, and then was swept toward the rapids. Without thinking, Jacob drove his horse in that direction, reaching out as the man swept past, but the current was too strong and his fingertips only brushed the drover's shirt. He watched in horror as the man was carried toward the white water, knowing there was nothing he could do, and then a rope sang through the air and settled over the drover's shoulders. Louisa had her rope on him, had thrown it from the far bank with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. She had dallied the rope around her saddle horn and was backing the bay gelding away from the water, the horse's powerful hindquarters straining as it dragged the drover to shore. By the time Jacob made it across with the last of the cattle, the man was on the bank coughing up water and looking shaken but alive. That was quick thinking, Jacob said as he dismounted beside Louisa. His heart was still pounding from the fear of losing one of his men, from the knowledge that he had been helpless to prevent it. You saved his life. It was lucky I had my rope ready, Louisa said, but there was a tremor in her voice that suggested the near disaster had shaken her too. Cottonwood Creek does not forgive mistakes. The drover who had gone in, a young man named Sam, came over to Louisa on unsteady legs. Miss Jenkins, I owe you my life. I do not know how to thank you. You can thank me by being more careful next time, Louisa said, but there was no heat in the words, only relief. And maybe stay a little farther from the edge of the main channel when we make the next crossing. They camped that night in a meadow a mile from the creek, and Jacob noticed that Louisa was quieter than usual at supper, her gaze distant. After the men had settled in for the night, he found her standing alone at the edge of the firelight, looking back toward the sound of Cottonwood Creek in the darkness. "You did good work today," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "That was as fine a piece of rescue work as I have ever seen." "I was afraid I would not reach him in time," Louisa admitted. Her arms were wrapped around herself despite the warm night, and Jacob could see the delayed shock in the way she held her body. "Another few seconds and he would have been in the rapids, if my throw had missed, if the rope had not settled clean." "But it did," Jacob said. He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to, and when she did not, he pulled her gently against his chest. She was stiff at first, resisting the comfort, and then she softened into him with a small sound that was almost a sob. "You saved him, Louisa. You were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. That is all anyone can do." She nodded against his shirt, and they stood that way for a long time, her head tucked under his chin, his arms around her shoulders. Jacob could feel her heartbeat gradually slowing to match his own, could feel the tension draining out of her body. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were bright but not quite overflowing. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For understanding. Most men would tell me it was not my concern, that losing drovers is just part of the work, but I hate it when someone almost dies on my watch. I hate knowing that my decisions put people at risk." "That is what makes you good at what you do," Jacob said. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture more intimate than he had intended, but she did not pull away. "If you did not care about the people you guide, you would be just another hired hand pointing directions from the shore. But you go into the water yourself, you take the same risks, and you do whatever it takes to bring everyone through safely. That matters, Louisa. It matters more than you know." She looked up at him, and in the dim light her face was very close to his. Jacob felt something pull tight in his chest, a wanting that had been building for days and had now become almost unbearable. He knew he should step back, should give her space, should remember that she was an employee and he had no right to feel this way about her. But when she lifted her hand and laid it against his chest, right over his heart, all those logical thoughts scattered like dandelion seeds in wind. "Jacob," she whispered, and hearing his name in her voice was like being struck by lightning. He kissed her. He bent his head and captured her mouth with his, gentle at first and then deeper when she responded, her lips parting under his, her hand fisting in his shirt. She tasted like creek water and coffee and something indefinably sweet, and Jacob felt like he was drowning in the best possible way. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and tried to find words for what he was feeling. "I have been wanting to do that for days," he admitted roughly. "I know," Louisa said, and there was a smile in her voice. "I wanted you to." "I am no good at pretty words," Jacob warned her. "I am just a cowman trying to build something that will last. But I am falling in love with you, Louisa Jenkins, and I think I have been since the moment you walked out of that river and told my men exactly where to cross." She laughed softly, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "I am falling in love with you too, Jacob Hammond. Though I should probably have my head examined for it. I swore I would never tie myself to a cattleman, that I would keep my independence and my freedom no matter what." "I would never ask you to give up who you are," Jacob said seriously. "Your skill, your knowledge, that is part of what I love about you. I want a partner, Louisa, not a decoration. Someone who can stand beside me and help me build something worth building." "A partner," Louisa repeated, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally made their way back to the campfire, Jacob's men very carefully did not look at them, though he caught more than one knowing grin in the darkness. The final crossing came at the Sacramento River itself, 3 days outside of Red Bluff. It was the widest water they had encountered, a broad expanse of green-brown current that looked deceptively calm from the bank. Jacob watched Louisa make her assessment with the confidence that came from having seen her work before, but even so, he felt tension knotting between his shoulders. This was the last obstacle between his herd and the Triple T Ranch, between his cattle and the buyers who were waiting, between the life he had been living and the life he wanted to build. "We cross here," Louisa announced, pointing to a spot where a gravel bar created a visible ripple in the current. "The water is slow, but it is deep in the middle, deeper than anything we have crossed so far. The cattle will have to swim for at least 100 yards. Can they do it?" Jacob looked at his herd, at the 300 head of cattle that had come through storms and rivers and rough country without major losses. They were trail-hardened now, steady on their feet, and they trusted his drovers to lead them where they needed to go. "They can do it," he said. "If you say this is the crossing, then this is where we go." Louisa nodded and mounted the bay gelding, but before she rode into the water, she turned to look at Jacob with an expression that made his heart ache. "If something goes wrong out there, if the current is worse than I think, you get yourself and your men to shore. Do not try to save the cattle. They are just animals, Jacob. You are not." "The same goes for you," Jacob said roughly. "You get into trouble out there, you let that horse bring you back to shore. I will not lose you for the sake of beef on the hoof." "Deal," Louisa said, and then she rode into the Sacramento River. The crossing took 2 hours from start to finish, and it was the longest 2 hours of Jacob's life. The cattle swam better than he had hoped, their noses up and their legs churning, following Louisa's path through the current. The water was deep enough in the middle that Jacob could not touch bottom on his horse, could feel the animal swimming beneath him, and the far bank seemed impossibly distant. But Louisa had chosen the line perfectly, as she always did, and the current carried them downstream at an angle that brought them out exactly where she had predicted they would land. When the last steer scrambled up onto dry ground, Jacob's men let out a whoop of triumph that startled birds from the cottonwood trees lining the river. They had done it. They had brought 300 head of cattle through some of the roughest country in California without losing a single animal to the water. And it was all because of the woman who sat her horse at the edge of the herd, water streaming from her clothes and a satisfied smile on her face. Jacob rode to her immediately, ignoring his men's grins and calls. When he reached her, he swung down from his horse and pulled her down from hers, right there in front of everyone, and kissed her soundly. She laughed against his mouth and kissed him back, her arms going around his neck, and his men cheered like they were at a barn dance. "I love you," Jacob said when they broke apart. He had not planned to say it like this, in front of witnesses, with river water soaking through his boots and the sun beating down on them. But the words came out anyway because they were true, and he could not hold them back any longer. "Louisa Jenkins, I love you, and I want to marry you if you will have me." Louisa's eyes went very wide. "Jacob, are you proposing to me in the middle of a cattle drive?" "I am proposing to you after you just guided my entire future safely across the Sacramento River," Jacob corrected. "And I cannot think of a better time or place to do it. Marry me, Louisa. Be my partner in every way that matters. Help me build a ranch and a life and something that will last longer than both of us." She was quiet for a long moment, and Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited for her answer. Then she reached up and cupped his face in her river-roughened hands and smiled at him like he had just given her the moon. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Jacob Hammond." His men whooped again, louder this time, and someone fired a pistol into the air in celebration. Jacob kissed Louisa again, tasting joy and river water and the promise of everything he had ever wanted, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They reached the Triple T Ranch 2 days later, driving the herd into pens that had been built specifically for the cattle drive. The ranch owner, a grizzled man named Tom Tucker, who had been running cattle in the valley for 30 years, came out to inspect the herd with the buyers who had come up from San Francisco. Jacob watched tensely as they walked through the pens, examining hooves and teeth and the overall condition of the animals, but his worry was unfounded. The cattle had come through the drive in excellent shape, and the buyers were pleased. "I will give you top dollar for the lot," the head buyer told Jacob, shaking his hand. "These are fine animals, Hammond. However you got them here, you did good work." "I had the best river guide in California," Jacob said, pulling Louisa forward. "Miss Louisa Jenkins kept us from losing a single head to the water. You want to thank someone, thank her." The buyer looked startled to find himself shaking hands with a woman, but he recovered quickly and gave Louisa a respectful nod. "Fine work, miss. I have heard your name before. Folks say you know these rivers like no one else." "I had a good teacher," Louisa said modestly, "but Mr. Hammond's men did the hard work. I just showed them where to cross." Tom Tucker laughed at that. "She is being humble, Hammond. I have seen men lose half their herd trying to cross the Sacramento in spring flood. The fact that you brought 300 head through without losses is nothing short of miraculous." They settled up the money that evening, and Jacob found himself holding a bank draft that represented everything he had worked for, enough to buy good land and stock it properly, enough to start the ranch he had been dreaming of since he was old enough to understand what ownership meant. But when he looked at the paper, all he could think about was the woman standing beside him, the woman who had made it all possible. "Where do you want to build our ranch?" he asked Louisa later, when they had a moment alone in the gathering dusk. "What kind of land are you looking for?" Louisa leaned against the corral fence and looked out at the valley spreading below them, the green fields and distant mountains. "I want water," she said. "A place with a good river or a strong creek, something reliable. Water is life out here, Jacob. Everything else can be managed if you have water." "Then we will find land with water," Jacob promised. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "We will build something together, you and me. A ranch that raises good cattle and good children, a place that respects the land and the water and the people who work it. Does that sound like a good life to you?" "It sounds like the best life," Louisa said. She turned in his arms to face him, her expression serious. "But I want to keep guiding too, at least sometimes. I do not want to lose that part of myself, Jacob. It is too important to who I am." "I would never ask you to give it up," Jacob assured her. "You can guide whenever you want to for as long as you want to." "I meant what I said about wanting a partner, Louisa. That means respecting what you bring to our life together, not trying to change you into something you are not." She smiled at him, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Then I think we are going to be very happy together, Jacob Hammond." They were married 3 weeks later in Wasco, in a simple ceremony at the small church that served the scattered ranching community. Louisa wore a dress of blue calico that she had purchased in town, and she carried wildflowers that Jacob had picked for her that morning. His sisters came down from Montana for the wedding, tough ranchwomen who took one look at Louisa and declared that their brother had found himself a keeper. The ceremony was short, and the reception was simple, held in the yard behind the church with food contributed by neighbors and music provided by a fiddler who had played at every wedding in the valley for the past 20 years. But when Jacob slipped the simple gold band onto Louisa's finger, and she said her vows in a clear, steady voice, he felt like he was holding the entire world in his hands. She was his wife now, his partner, the person he would build a life with, and the weight of that responsibility and that joy was almost overwhelming. They spent their wedding night in the small house Jacob had been renting in Wasco, and if their coming together was more tender than passionate, more about comfort and connection than grand romance, it suited them both perfectly. Jacob learned the landscape of Louisa's body the way she had taught him to read rivers, with patience and attention, and a desire to understand what mattered. And when she curled against him afterward, her head on his chest and her breath warm against his skin, he felt a contentment settle into his bones that he had never known before. "I love you," Louisa murmured, already half asleep. "My river cowboy." Jacob smiled in the darkness and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you too, my river guide." They spent the next 2 months searching for land, riding through the valley and up into the foothills, looking for the right combination of water and grass and protected valleys that would support a cattle ranch. Louisa evaluated every creek and stream they came across, testing the water quality, checking for signs of seasonal flooding, making sure there would be reliable water year-round. Jacob looked at the grass and the shelter, the access to markets and the quality of the neighbors. It was a partnership in the truest sense, both of them contributing their expertise to find something that would work for their shared future. They found it in late summer, a valley tucked into the eastern foothills of the Coast Range about 15 miles west of Wasco. A strong creek ran through it, fed by springs higher in the mountains, and Louisa pronounced it perfect after spending 2 days studying the watershed. The valley had good grass and natural shelter from winter storms, and there was enough flat land near the creek to build a house and barns. The previous owner had started a ranch there, but had given up after a series of dry years, and he was willing to sell for a price that Jacob could afford with the money from his cattle drive. They bought the land in September and started building immediately, racing to get a house and a barn up before winter set in. Jacob's sisters sent 2 of their ranch hands down from Montana to help with the heavy work, and neighbors came from miles around to help raise the walls and put on the roof. By the time the first rains came in November, they had a snug house with 2 rooms and a loft, a barn big enough for a dozen horses and a milk cow, and corrals strong enough to hold the small herd of cattle Jacob had purchased to start building his stock. Louisa proved to be as capable at ranching as she was at river guiding, working alongside Jacob from dawn to dusk, mending fences and doctoring sick animals, and keeping the books that tracked their expenses and income. But she also kept her hand in guiding, and twice that fall she left the ranch for a week at a time to guide wagon trains across the rivers, coming home tired but satisfied, with money in her pocket and stories to tell. Jacob never begrudged her those trips, though he missed her fiercely every moment she was gone. He understood that guiding was part of who she was, as essential to her identity as ranching was to his, and he would not have asked her to give it up any more than he would have asked her to stop breathing. When she came home from those trips, he welcomed her with open arms and listened to her stories with genuine interest, and their partnership deepened in ways he had never expected. They settled into the rhythm of ranch life as fall turned to winter, and winter gave way to spring. It was hard work, the kind of labor that left them both bone-tired at the end of each day, but it was satisfying in a way that nothing else had ever been. They were building something together, shaping the land and their lives into something that would endure, and every fence post they set, every calf they delivered, every improvement they made to the ranch was a testament to their shared vision. In the spring, Louisa discovered she was pregnant. She told Jacob one evening as they sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the mountains, and he felt a joy so profound it nearly stopped his heart. A child. They were going to have a child, a son or daughter who would grow up on this land they had built together, who would learn from both of them how to work and live and thrive in this hard country. "Are you pleased?" Louisa asked, watching his face in the fading light. "I know we have not talked much about children yet, but I thought you would want them." "Pleased is not a big enough word," Jacob said. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. "I am overjoyed, Louisa, overwhelmed, terrified that I will not be a good enough father, but mostly just incredibly, impossibly happy." She laughed and kissed him back. "I am terrified too, but I think we will figure it out together the same way we have figured out everything else." The pregnancy was not easy. Louisa was sick for the first 3 months, and there were days when she could barely keep down water, much less food. Jacob worried constantly, bringing her weak tea and toast, sitting with her when the nausea was particularly bad, trying to take on more of the ranch work so she could rest. But Louisa was stubborn and refused to be treated like an invalid, insisting on doing her share of the work even when it was clear she was exhausted. "I am having a baby, not dying of consumption," she told him irritably when he tried to make her stay in bed one morning. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, Jacob. I can manage." "I know you can manage," Jacob said carefully, having learned that pregnancy had made his normally even-tempered wife somewhat volatile. "But there is no shame in accepting help when you need it. Let me take care of you, Louisa. That is what husbands are for." She softened at that, her expression losing some of its defensive edge. "I am sorry. I do not mean to snap at you. I just hate feeling weak and useless." "You are neither of those things," Jacob assured her. "You are growing a whole new person inside your body. That is not weak. That is the strongest thing anyone can do." As her pregnancy advanced, Louisa had to give up guiding work, and Jacob could see how much it chafed at her to stay home while others crossed the rivers she knew so well. He tried to find ways to keep her engaged with the work she loved, bringing her maps and asking her advice about water rights and irrigation, talking through problems that other ranchers were having with river crossings. It helped, but he knew she missed being out in the water herself, missed the physical challenge and the satisfaction of bringing people through safely. Their son was born in early December, a cold, clear day when the mountains were dusted with the first snow of winter. The birth was hard, longer and more difficult than either of them had anticipated, and there were moments when Jacob was genuinely afraid he might lose Louisa, might lose everything that mattered to him in one terrible instant. But she fought through with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. And when the midwife finally placed their son in his arms, Jacob felt tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered, staring at the tiny red face, the miniature fingers that curled around his thumb with surprising strength. "Louisa, he is absolutely perfect." "Let me see him," Louisa said weakly from the bed, and Jacob brought the baby to her, placing him carefully in her arms. She looked down at their son with an expression of wonder, and Jacob felt his heart expand until it seemed too large for his chest. "Hello, little one. We have been waiting for you." They named him James, after Jacob's father, and he was a robust, healthy baby who seemed determined to make his presence known from his first breath. He cried with impressive volume and nursed with single-minded intensity, and within a few days, he had both of his parents wrapped completely around his tiny fingers. Jacob found himself spending hours just watching his son sleep, marveling at the perfection of him, at the fact that he and Louisa had created this new life together. Louisa recovered slowly from the birth, and Jacob could see it frustrated her to be confined to the house, to have to move carefully and rest frequently. But she threw herself into motherhood with the same focus she brought to everything else, learning to nurse and change and soothe the baby with an efficiency that made Jacob smile. She was a natural mother, patient and tender in ways he had not expected, though he supposed he should not have been surprised. She had always been good at understanding what was needed and providing it, whether it was a frightened animal or a worried drover or now a hungry infant. By the time spring came again, Louisa was back on her feet and eager to return to work, both on the ranch and as a guide. Jacob had hired a Mexican woman named Rosa from a neighboring ranch to help with the house and the baby. And with Rosa's assistance, Louisa was able to take on a few short guiding jobs, trips that kept her away for only a day or two at a time. She came back from those jobs glowing with satisfaction, her old confidence restored, and Jacob was grateful to see her happy again. The ranch prospered over the next few years. Jacob built up his herd slowly and carefully, purchasing quality breeding stock and culling ruthlessly to maintain the highest standards. Louisa managed the water rights and irrigation, ensuring they always had enough water for the cattle and the garden she had planted near the house. They worked together seamlessly, each contributing their particular strengths, and their reputation grew throughout the valley. People knew that Jacob Hammond ran good cattle, and that his wife could guide anyone safely across any river in California, and that combination of skills made them valuable members of the community. James grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who was fascinated by everything his parents did. By the time he was 3, he was following Jacob out to the corrals in the morning and trailing after Louisa when she went to check the creek levels. They were careful to teach him respect for water and animals, knowing that a ranch could be a dangerous place for a small child, but they also gave him the freedom to explore and learn, to develop the same love for the land that they both shared. When James was 4, Louisa became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, as though her body remembered what to do and was more willing to cooperate. Their daughter was born on a soft spring evening, and they named her Lily after Louisa's mother. She was smaller than James had been, but just as healthy, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. James was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to touch her constantly, to help with her care, and Jacob and Louisa had to gently teach him to be careful with the baby. The ranch continued to grow. By the time James was 7 and Lily was 3, Jacob owned over 500 head of cattle and was running them on land that stretched across 3 valleys. He hired drovers and ranch hands to help with the work, good men who respected Louisa's authority as much as his own, and the ranch gained a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Louisa still guided occasionally, though less frequently now that she had 2 children to manage, but she never gave it up entirely. It was too much a part of who she was, too essential to her sense of self, and Jacob understood that. On a warm summer evening, when James was 8 and Lily was 4, the family sat together on the porch of their house, which had been expanded over the years to include additional bedrooms and a proper parlor. Jacob held Lily on his lap while James sat next to his mother, and they watched the sun set over the mountains that bounded their valley. The cattle were settled for the night, the work was done, and for a moment, everything was peaceful. "Tell us the story again," James said, looking up at his mother. "Tell us about how you met Papa." Louisa smiled and put her arm around her son. "I've told you that story 100 times. Tell it again," Lily chimed in from Jacob's lap. "I like the part where Mama saves the man in the river." "All right," Louisa said. She looked across at Jacob, and even after all these years, the love in her eyes made his heart skip. It was the spring of 1878, and the rivers were running high with snowmelt. Your father had a herd of cattle he needed to get across the Sacramento River, and he hired me to guide them because his regular guide was sick. And you rode into the river first, James said eagerly, to show them where to cross. That is right. I rode your father's horse, a bay gelding named River, and I showed them the safest place to ford. Your father trusted me to guide his whole herd, even though some of his men did not think a woman could do it. But you could, Lily said firmly, because you are the best river guide in California. I do not know about that, Louisa said modestly, but I did know those rivers very well, and your father trusted me, which meant everything. He saw what I could do instead of what I was, and that made all the difference. Jacob reached over and took Louisa's hand, their fingers twining together in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. I trusted you with my whole herd, he said softly. And then I trusted you with my whole heart, best decision I ever made. Second best, Louisa corrected with a smile. The best decision was saying yes when you proposed to me in the middle of a cattle drive, soaking wet and covered in river mud. Their children giggled at that, and Jacob laughed too, remembering that day with perfect clarity, remembering the joy and terror and absolute certainty he had felt. Everything good in his life had flowed from that moment, from that decision to offer his heart to a woman who could guide any river better than any man he knew, a woman who had proven herself worthy of his trust 1,000 times over. As darkness fell and the first stars came out, they stayed there together on the porch, a family built on trust and water and love, their future stretching out before them as certain and eternal as the rivers that carved these valleys from ancient stone. Jacob looked at his wife and children, at the ranch they had built together, at the life they had created out of hard work and determination and faith in each other. And he knew with absolute conviction that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. James grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did, who learned to read cattle and land with his father's eye and to read water with his mother's instincts. Lily proved to have a gift for horses, gentling even the most difficult animals with patience and understanding, and Louisa taught her everything she knew about working with creatures that responded better to kindness than to force. When James was 15, Louisa took him on his first guiding job, a wagon train that needed to cross the Kings River during spring flood. Jacob stayed home with Lily and worried for 3 solid days until they returned, both of them tired but triumphant. James talked for weeks about the crossing, about how his mother had read the current and found the safest path, about how she had thrown her rope to save a wagon that had slipped its traces in the middle of the river. He looked at Louisa with new respect after that trip, seeing her not just as his mother, but as a skilled professional doing dangerous and important work. Lily asked to learn guiding too, and though Jacob worried about his daughter taking such risks, he understood that she had inherited her mother's courage and her love for the water. So when she was 12, Louisa began teaching her the same skills her own father had taught her: how to read currents and sandbars, how to judge depth and flow, how to throw a rope with deadly accuracy from the back of a moving horse. Lily took to it naturally, and within a few years, she was accompanying her mother and brother on guiding jobs, the 3 of them working together as a team. The ranch continued to thrive. Jacob made good decisions about breeding stock and grazing land, and his cattle became known throughout California for their quality. He hired good people and treated them fairly, and many of his ranch hands stayed for years, becoming almost like extended family. The house was expanded again to accommodate guests, because there were always travelers passing through who needed a meal and a place to stay. And Jacob and Louisa, had a reputation for hospitality that brought people from all over the valley to their table. Louisa's reputation as a guide spread even wider. Stories were told about her skill and courage, about the impossible crossings she had made, the lives she had saved, the cattle and wagons she had brought safely through water that would have defeated lesser guides. Men sought her out specifically when they needed to move large herds or valuable cargo across difficult rivers, knowing that if anyone could get them through, it was Louisa Jenkins Hammond. She was in her 40s now, still strong and capable, though Jacob could see the silver threading through her dark hair and the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. To him, she was more beautiful than ever, seasoned and tested by life and made stronger for it. They added 3 more children to their family over the years, 2 more boys and another girl, and the house rang with noise and laughter and the organized chaos of a large family. Jacob built additions onto the house until it was almost a sprawl, with bedrooms for all the children and a large dining room where they could all eat together. Louisa managed the household with the same efficiency she brought to guiding rivers, making sure everyone had what they needed, that work was divided fairly, that no one felt overlooked or undervalued. It was exhausting work, but she never complained, and Jacob loved her more with every passing year for the strength and grace she brought to their shared life. When James was 22, he married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring valley, a smart, capable young woman named Sarah who fit into the family as though she had always been there. They built a house on the far side of the ranch, and James took over more of the daily management of the cattle operation, freeing Jacob to spend more time working on water rights and irrigation projects that benefited the whole valley. Jacob was proud of his son, proud of the man he had become, and grateful that James wanted to continue the work they had started. Lily was 20 when she announced she was going into the guiding business full-time, partnering with her mother to handle the increased demand for their services. By now, both women were legendary in the valley, known for their skill and reliability, and together they commanded top prices for their work. Jacob worried about them every time they left on a job, but he also understood that this was who they were, what they were meant to do, and he would not have asked them to be anything else. The younger children grew and found their own paths. Their second son, Thomas, became interested in engineering and went to study in San Francisco, planning to come back and help with the irrigation systems the valley needed to support more ranches. Their third son, Daniel, loved horses like his sister Lily and started a breeding program that produced some of the finest cow ponies in California. Their youngest daughter, Grace, had her mother's gift for numbers and took over managing the ranch accounts, tracking expenses and income with a precision that made even Louisa proud. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Louisa held a celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone who had been part of their life over the past quarter century. Friends and family came from all over California and beyond, filling the house and spilling out into the yard. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. And as the sun set over the mountains, Jacob stood with Louisa on the porch where they had spent so many quiet evenings together, and looked out at the crowd of people who had come to celebrate with them. "We built a good life," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders, "better than I ever dreamed possible." "We did," Louisa agreed, leaning into him. "And we did it together the same way we have done everything, as partners." "As partners," Jacob echoed. He turned her to face him, taking both her hands in his. "I want you to know, Louisa, that every single day of these past 25 years has been a gift. You made me better than I was, taught me things I never would have learned on my own, gave me a family and a home and a purpose." I love you more now than I did on the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is my promise to you." Louisa's eyes were bright with tears. "You gave me a life I never thought I could have, Jacob, a partnership based on respect and trust and genuine love. You never tried to make me into something I was not, never asked me to give up the things that mattered to me. You stood beside me and supported me and loved me exactly as I am. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, and I will be grateful for it every day of my life." They kissed there on the porch as their children and grandchildren and friends cheered and applauded, and Jacob felt the same surge of joy he had felt at their wedding, at the birth of each of their children, at every major milestone of their life together. This was what mattered. Not the size of his herd or the extent of his land, but this woman in his arms and the life they had built together, the family they had raised, the legacy they would leave behind. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joy and sorrow as years always do. Jacob's health began to fail when he was in his 60s, his body worn down by decades of hard physical labor. And though he fought against the weakness, he eventually had to accept that his ranching days were largely behind him. James took over the ranch completely, running it with his father's principles and his mother's eye for detail, and Jacob spent his days on the porch, watching the valley he loved and thinking about everything they had accomplished. Louisa stayed strong longer than Jacob did, still guiding occasional river crossings well into her 60s, though she finally retired at 65 after a particularly difficult crossing that left her exhausted for days. She said she knew it was time to let the younger generation take over, time to trust that she had taught them well enough to carry on without her. Lily and several of her daughters had taken over the guiding business by then, and they did good work, maintaining the reputation their mother and grandmother had built. Jacob died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, on a warm summer night with Louisa beside him, and his children and grandchildren in the house around him. His last words were, "I love you, my river guide," and Louisa held his hand as he slipped away, her face wet with tears but also touched with gratitude that they had been given so many years together. She lived another 5 years after Jacob's death, staying active and engaged with the ranch and her family, spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days when the rivers ran wild, and a woman could make her living guiding cattle across them. She talked about Jacob constantly, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations, making sure they understood what kind of man he had been, how much he had accomplished, how deeply he had loved them all. When Louisa died at 77, surrounded by her family, she was buried next to Jacob on a hill overlooking the creek that ran through their ranch. Her children and grandchildren gathered around the graves, and James spoke about his parents with a voice that shook with emotion. "My father used to say that the best decision he ever made was trusting my mother to guide his herd across the rivers," James said. "But I think the real best decision was recognizing that she was someone worth building a life with, someone whose strength and skill and courage made her an equal partner in every way. They built this ranch together, raised us together, and created something that will last for generations. That is their legacy, not the cattle or the land, but the love and partnership they showed us every single day of their lives together." The ranch continued to thrive under the management of James and his children, and then his grandchildren after him. The irrigation systems that Thomas had designed brought water to parts of the valley that had been too dry for ranching, and the valley bloomed with new life. Lily's guiding business expanded to include training programs for new guides, passing on the knowledge that Louisa had learned from her father and refined over a lifetime of work. Daniel's horse breeding program produced animals that were prized throughout the West for their intelligence and endurance. Grace's financial management ensured the ranch stayed profitable through good years and bad. And always, the story was told of how it all began, of the young woman who could guide any river better than the men, and the cowboy who had trusted her with his whole herd, and then with his whole heart. It became a legend in the valley, passed down through generations, embellished and romanticized, but always rooted in the truth of what had actually happened. A man and a woman who had met by chance, who had recognized something valuable in each other, who had built a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love, and who had left behind something that would endure long after they were gone. The creek still runs through that valley, cutting its path through the land the way it has for thousands of years. The ranch still stands, expanded and modernized, but still recognizably the place that Jacob and Louisa built together. And on the hill overlooking the water, two simple gravestones mark the resting place of a cowboy and a river guide who found in each other exactly what they needed, and who built from that foundation something beautiful and lasting and true. Their great-great-grandchildren run the ranch now, young men and women who have inherited not just land and cattle, but a tradition of hard work and fair dealing and respect for the water that gives life to this valley. They still tell the story of Jacob and Louisa on summer evenings, keeping alive the memory of where they came from and what their ancestors built. And sometimes, when the rivers run high with spring melt and the current runs fast and wild, they swear they can feel the presence of a woman who knew water better than anyone, who could read its moods and intentions, who could guide anything or anyone safely across no matter how difficult the crossing. The legacy of trust and partnership that Jacob and Louisa created lived on in every generation that followed, a reminder that the strongest foundations are built not on land or wealth but on love and respect and the willingness to see the value in another person, regardless of what convention might say. They had been ahead of their time in many ways, but they had also been exactly what their time needed. Two people who refused to be limited by expectations, and who created instead a life that was entirely their own. And so the story ends where all good stories should end, with love triumphant and a family thriving and a legacy that will endure as long as rivers flow through California valleys, and cattle graze on green grass, and people remember that the best partnerships are built on trust and respect, and the courage to see each other clearly. Jacob and Louisa's love story became part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of the valley they had loved, a testament to what is possible when two people find each other against all odds and decide to build something together that will outlast them both.